Well, hello everybody, it's Rob here at Trinity Streetsville, and here at Trinity, look at us, we're just a group of ordinary people learning to follow Jesus in our own day. You know, Jesus had a lot of things to say that didn't make a lot of sense to us, but one of the most confusing things he probably ever said was that there is more joy in giving than in receiving. Pretty confusing, eh? But our happiness and our joy depends on it. So today we are beginning a brand new teaching series called A Generous Life. We're going to look at some of the off-the-wall teachings that Jesus had when it came to money and giving. You know, Jesus is quite famous for saying a lot of things that seem to go against common sense. So for example, Jesus says things like, whoever wants to be great must be a servant, right? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Doesn't greatness come from climbing upwards, not from going down? Or Jesus says, power is made perfect in weakness, and that doesn't make any sense. So aren't you supposed to hide your weaknesses and build on your strengths? Or Jesus says, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. That doesn't make any sense. If you lose your life, what else have you got? Isn't that all you've got is your life? Or Jesus says you're to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. That doesn't make any sense. Aren't we supposed to crush and cancel our enemies, not bless them? And Jesus says, those who humble themselves will be exalted. Well, that doesn't seem right either. Aren't the humble forgotten? And those who exalt themselves, they're the ones that we remember. But perhaps the most counterintuitive of all these crazy sayings that Jesus mentions is this one. He says, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Now, the word blessed there is the Greek word makarios. And that word means blessed, but it also means happy. It also means fortunate, and it even means joyful. Makarios actually was this Greek word that spoke about this exalted, state, the highest state of well-being, the state of the gods even. And so really you could translate this one that Jesus mentioned into this. You could say, there is more joy in giving than in getting. There's more happiness in giving than in getting. There's more makarios, more of this joyful life in giving than in getting. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Of all Jesus's backwards statements, surely this one is the most backwards and the most hard to believe. Because doesn't joy actually come from getting more, not giving more? Isn't happiness found in upgrading? Upgrading your wardrobe, upgrading your phone, upgrading your car, upgrading your vacations, upgrading your home, right? Whether it's ads or influencers or even your financial planner, they will tell you that more money is going to guarantee you more happiness and more joy in your life. No. There is more happiness in getting and holding on to stuff than giving. It is not the other way around, Jesus. I would say that when I feel this way, it's not just because of commercials and ads and stuff like that. I think it's actually deep in my own DNA, and maybe it's in yours as well. I grew up, I think, feeling that the more you have, the happier that you will be. And maybe that's because, I grew up as a son of immigrant parents, farmers who came over, and they didn't have very much at all. They had next to nothing. And for them, there was great happiness and great fulfillment in growing their wealth and developing their success. And I benefited from all that, but I think the subliminal message that got in there and has shaped my own default setting and default thinking is that joy and satisfaction and happiness comes from getting. It comes from earning. It comes from accumulating, not from giving it away. Richard Foster, in his book, The Joy of Simplicity, he says, the unreasoned boast abounds that the good life is found in accumulation and that more is better. He says down here, we don't even question it. We accept this notion without question. And as a result, contemporary society has become psychotic, so consumed with affluence and accumulation. Now, when we hear Jesus say there's more joy in giving than there is in receiving, I'm speaking for myself, but maybe you too, I kind of roll my eyes. And I say, okay, Jesus, yes, okay. I know that giving is a good thing to do. And I know that giving is maybe the moral thing to do. And giving might even be the quote-unquote right thing to do. But come on, Jesus, do not try to explain to me that it is a joyful thing to do, that it is actually leads me on a pathway toward a happy life. Well, surprise, surprise, Jesus was actually right. He's been right all along, because over the last few decades, a whole lot of research has been piling up showing that what Jesus said 2,000 years ago is right on the money, no pun intended, right? There really is more joy in giving than getting. Study after study show that generous people, they actually are happier, they have lower levels of depression and anxiety, they have stronger relationships, they have longer life expectancies, they laugh more. And neuroscientists have found that when you give, it lights up the same parts of your brain that would light up like when you eat a great meal, or that when you fall in love. And the studies will show this isn't just one demographic or one kind of gender. It cuts across all personalities, all ethnicities, all income levels. There's one major study that I was looking at this week that says that this phenomena is a universal feature of all human experience. So there was a study called the Science of Generosity Initiative. It was done at University of Notre Dame, and Hilary Davidson and Christian Smith, they wrote a book called The Paradox of Generosity, right? And this book, is based on thousands of interviews and all sorts of it was a 5-year study, thousands of participants. But look what they say. They say, people rightly say that money can't buy happiness, but money and happiness are still related in a curious way. Happiness can result not from spending more money on ourselves, but by giving money away to others. This isn't just a nice idea, it's a social, scientific fact. And they go on to say, actually, that first, the more generous people are, obviously, they're happier, they're healthier, they have more purpose, they enjoy life more. But then they secondly say, despite all that evidence, people, generally speaking, fail to lead generous lives. So if you look at the science, if you look at the culture, more money equaling more happiness is just not true. Actually, Jesus was right? Generosity is the pathway to a joyful life. And so what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks is we're going to be looking at this topic of generosity. Why? Because your happiness and your joy depends on it. And generosity is so important. It should come as no surprise to us that Jesus spends upwards of 25% of his teaching time talking about money at some level. That would be the equivalent of me preaching a sermon about money every 4 weeks. And if I did that, I dare say there'd be a lot less people in church. And mostly that would be because of a couple of objections, all right? Here is the first objection. Money is a very sensitive subject. And it's even more sensitive when it comes into church. The last time I preached about money here at Trinity was exactly a year ago. Back in November, we kicked off our financial campaign, our Gather and Grow campaign. On that Sunday, we had a visitor with us that day. And granted, that probably wouldn't have been the best Sunday for a newcomer to visit Trinity. But they left us one of the worst Google reviews ever. You can read it. You can go and read it right now. I don't want you to go read it right now, but you should read it because it is still there. It was exactly a year ago. I'm going to read to you what this gentleman said about Trinity. Okay, here's what he said. He said, 1/3 of the service was dedicated to a full-on commercial about how the church needs money. We were literally accosted by representative members, one of which was the minister's wife. They asked prying questions. I got the distinct impression we were being sized up for how much we could potentially bring into the church from a monetary standpoint. I could drone on and on and on. Oh, please don't. Please, about how this place felt gross. Your doors are meant to be open to anyone. He should have come last week. I talked about open doors. And then he ends, he said, do better. Do better. He said, I gave this guy a call afterwards and I talked to him for half an hour, but I could not convince him that we were anything but a money-grubbing church, and he would not remove his comments either, right? Even his comments about Sally. I mean, come on, Sally, of all the people to get a 1-star review, Sally. I mean, Sally, do better. Do better. So my point is, though, talking about money touches a nerve. And as we're going to hear today, money is in some ways a god of our age. And there's part of us that says, do not go there, do not talk about that, do not touch that, stay away. So that's one big objection. Another big objection is that generosity is more than giving your money, isn't it? Yes, yes. Well, that's true. Generosity includes giving your time and giving your relationship and giving your expertise and giving your attention and giving your words and your influence and all that stuff. Yes, it's all true. But when Jesus speaks about generosity, 9 times out of 10, he's actually speaking about money. Now, as John Mark Comer says, he says, generosity is true about more than giving your money, but it is not about less than giving your money. And it is real easy to skip over this whole money topic, and instead, let's focus on giving time. Let's focus on giving our words. But Jesus himself zeroed in on money when he spoke about generosity. And so what I'll want to do in the time that I have left this morning is I'm going to look at some of that great teaching about generosity that came from Jesus. If you have a Bible, you can take it out or turn it on. We're going to look at Matthew 6, 19 to 24. You've got some sermon notes there to follow along. I just want to show you kind of 5 things in this that Jesus teaches us about giving. Here's the first thing he teaches us. Jesus mentions that in the human heart, there is this built-in desire to accumulate stuff and stockpile stuff. That's just who we are. When I was a boy, it all started when I started collecting comic books, Punisher War Journal, Wolverine, and then I started collecting basketball cards, NBA hoops and skybox cards. Anyways, those things are still in my garage to this day. I was 8, 10 years old when I started collecting them. I don't know why I carry them around. In fact, they fell over in our garage about a year ago, and a whole bunch of them rotted and disintegrated on the garage floor. We love to pile up stuff, and it might start with toys and it might start with trading cards, but as adults, we still collect pay raises and we collect investment returns and we collect home equity and RSPs. It's just a different version of the same impulse that we've had since we were born. And Jesus actually says that's normal and there's nothing particularly wrong with wanting to store up treasure. The problem, Jesus says, secondly, is though we store it up in the wrong place. Jesus calls us to store our treasure in heaven, not on earth. Now, heaven here does not mean this place that you go when you die, does not mean this place, faraway place in the clouds. In the first century Jewish world, heaven was the place where God reigned. It was where God's stuff was happening. It was God's realm, right? So Jesus is saying the place to invest your resources and your money is not in what is temporary, not in what is fragile and is just going to disappear one day, but invest in something that is eternal. Invest in stuff that is lasting. Invest in God's kingdom and what God is doing right now on earth. That will last forever. Other stuff will not last forever. And thirdly, Jesus points out a very interesting fact about the human heart in this teaching. And that is this, that we usually think our money follows our hearts. Our money follows our desires. In other words, we spend our money on the things that we love and the things that we really, really value. But Jesus says the opposite is also true. that wherever our money goes, our hearts will eventually follow that as well. So the more money we have and the more stuff that we accumulate, then the more we fall in love with that stuff. And the more we get greedy for more of that stuff. And the more we fear of losing that stuff. And then pretty soon our hearts and our minds and our souls are so fixated on what we have, and we spend so much of our lives worrying about the fact that we'll lose it or wishing that we would have more of it. It's our hearts go to our money. It's not just that our money goes to our heart's desires. It works the other way around, Jesus says. Fourth interesting part of this teaching Jesus shares with us is this interesting idea about our eyes. He says that the eye is the lamp of the body. And what's he say? If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Now, at first, this sounds like a very cryptic and strange teaching. Well, what is this eye that Jesus is talking about? Is this one a spooky Halloween thing, an eye? No. In fact, if you were to read your Bible, many Bibles will have a little footnote attached to this verse. And the footnote will say that the Greek word for the Greek word for healthy here can imply generosity. And the Greek word for unhealthy implies stingy. So what this means is, according to this first century idiom, there are two ways that your eyes can look at the world. One is with generous eyes, healthy eyes. The other is with stingy eyes or, unhealthy eyes, right? Today, what we normally call that is that you see the world either from an abundance mindset or you see the world from a scarcity mindset. If you have an abundance mindset, you've got a healthy eye. Congratulations. You look at the world and you see everything that God has given you, and it's more than enough. You receive your whole life as a gift. You've got a healthy eye. But if you look at the world and you just see lack, and there's not enough, and all you see is scarcity, then you have an unhealthy eye. And you actually really don't believe that God is going to provide for you. All you see is what you do not have. And you can have two people who have the same job and they live on the same street and they make the same income and they have the same bills and they have the same dreams. One can have a healthy eye and one can have an unhealthy eye. One can see with the lens of abundance and the other just sees what they don't have. It's a good question to ask ourselves, is how do we look at the world? Are our eyes healthy or are our eyes unhealthy? And that leads to the fifth and final part of Jesus' teaching from Matthew 6 here on money. And that is that Jesus makes the case that money is not neutral. I know deep down we all want to believe that money is just a tool. It's not good or bad in and of itself. There's nothing spiritual about it. But Jesus seems to say, actually, no, there is a spiritual aspect to money itself. It doesn't just sit there quietly in your wallet. It actually competes for your worship. Jesus says no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and, what is that word? Mammon. Mammon. Now, your Bible probably said money there, but if you were to look in the Greek, you would actually see that Jesus uses this Aramaic word, mammon, and it's not translated into the Greek. And scholars think that because Jesus used the word mammon, because he was referring to this Syrian god, this god of wealth, which was called Mammon. So, in other words, money isn't just like a thing, it's a rival god. And again, we don't want to believe that. We don't want to believe that money itself is good or evil, but Jesus seems to know better, and he realizes that there's a spiritual gravity that money has. And if we don't take care, it'll become this satanic force. And it does, doesn't it? Doesn't money fuel greed and war and violence and injustice and environmental degradation all across our planet? So that's why Jesus doesn't just say, hey, listen, you should not serve both God and mammon. No, he says you cannot serve both God and mammon. It's an impossibility. They are two different gods. You're either going to love one and hate the other, or, you can't have it both ways. So Let's just review those 5 main points Jesus teaches. We all have this desire to store up money. But Jesus tells us to invest our money in God. Don't stockpile it on earth, because if we do, then actually our hearts may end up falling in love with it. And then we're never going to feel like we have enough of it. And soon we'll be worshiping it as a rival God. Now that sounds horrible. Who wants that? Nobody wants that. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen to you and doesn't happen to me? How do we become generous people that get real joy from giving it away and not holding on to it? Well, I'm going to close by suggesting 3 ways. The first way is you have to let God change your thinking. Because God shows us what generosity looks like. And it's not that just God teaches us about generosity, it's that God, in God's self, is generosity. If you think about the idea of the Trinity, right? The Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This God is a family of self-giving love. The Father is always giving to the Son. The Son is always giving to the Spirit. The Spirit is always giving to the Father. The Father is always giving to... There's this ongoing generosity and self-sacrifice that is constantly happening within the Trinity, within the Godhead itself. That's just who God is. God, by God's very nature, is the most generous being in the entire universe. One professor put it this way: as Trinity, the Christian God is eternally self-giving God. God created man in his self-giving image. So that's who God is, and we are created in the image of God. So you see, becoming a happier, more joyful, generous person, it doesn't start with me or someone else giving a sermon on, tithing. It starts before time, and it starts before space and before anything existed, with just who God is. That's where it all starts. And Scripture teaches that is who God is. In Genesis 1, we read that God said, I give you. God is giving. He's always, I give you every seed-bearing plant. I give you every tree. All of this is yours. That giving and gave, that language comes up again and again in that very first book of the Bible. Now, it's very interesting because a few verses later, Satan tries to convince humankind that God actually isn't generous. Oh, did God really say that? Is God really generous? Can you really depend on him? Isn't he holding out on you? And it is very telling that the very first sin that ever happened, where human brokenness begins, it's actually when we stopped seeing God as a generous giver and we started to become takers, right? When she saw the fruit, she took some of it and ate it. So that's step one. The first thing we have to do is let God change our thinking, to recapture this true picture of who God is, and then let that just work its way through your life. You're going to start to become a more generous person. But the second thing you have to do is let the gospel now change your hearts. God may change your thinking, but Jesus wants to change your heart. Generosity is at the heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world that he, say it with me, gave his one and only Son. Everywhere Jesus goes, he is giving. Everywhere he goes, there's generosity. Oh, you've only got a few loaves of fish? Boom, enough for everyone. Oh, you've only got these empty water jars? Boom, wine for everyone. Oh, you're sick. Oh, you're broken. Oh, you're sad. Oh, you're lonely. Boom, here's healing. Here's more forgiveness. Here's peace. Here's a brand new life. Everywhere Jesus goes, he is constantly turning scarcity into abundance for everyone. But it's on the cross, actually, that we see God's generosity most clearly. Jesus is the richest being in the entire universe, the one who spoke all the galaxies into existence, and here he is emptying himself out on the cross. He became poor. He enters into our poverty, and he's not just poor financially, but completely. He's poor in comfort. He's poor in power. He's poor in life. Right? The cross is where this God of abundance steps into our scarcity, and He's able to turn even death into a gift for us. That's the heart of the gospel, that the richest one became the poorest, so that the poorest of us could become rich in him. And so now once you've let God change your thinking, oh yeah, that's who God is. And once you've let the gospel change your heart, oh yeah, that's what Jesus did for me. Then you can begin to let generosity change your habits. If you've been following Jesus for a little bit, for any amount of time in your life, you should start to see change. Not just in your thinking, and not just in your heart, but in your habits around money. If you're not seeing those kind of changes, then it raises a few red flags, like, am I stalled out in my spiritual growth? Because this should be a natural progression. And the research on generosity says that it all begins with changing our habits around money, right? For generosity to make you happier, it can't just be a one-time event. Or it can't even be just like random acts of kindness. It has to be a habit, a regular part of your life. I just want to read to you a little bit from this study that I mentioned earlier. This is what they say. They say, our emphasis here is on practices of generosity, not single generous acts. What matters about practices compared to one-time acts is that they're repeated behaviors that involve recurrent intention and attention. Those are the kind of expressions of generosity that actually enhance people's well-being, that become the practices of generosity. Now listen to this. By contrast, one-time or infrequent acts of generosity seem not to be associated with greater well-being. This includes being an organ donor, estate giving through wills, lending your possessions, or donating blood infrequently. This is how habits work on us. I cannot just go flip a switch in my heart and get rid of all the fear, get rid of all the greed, and just become a more generous person. I have to do stuff. You know what I can do? I can buy someone lunch. That's a thing I can do. I can sponsor a child in Honduras. I can do that. I can give to my church. And as I practice generosity, God is doing something in here. He's doing something in my heart, something that I could never do by my own best intentions. I start to move from fear to trust. I start to move from worry to peace. And yes, I even start to move toward joy. And I start to discover that what Jesus said is true, that there is more joy in giving than in receiving. In closing, let me just ask you this. Have you ever met an unhappy, generous person? Probably not. Have you ever met a former giver? Probably not. Maybe they exist, but probably not, because most people who have enjoyed and discovered the joy of living a generous life, they never turn back. And yes, it costs them financially, but they get back far more than they ever give away, because there's more joy in giving than in receiving. We'll pick this up again next week, but for now, thanks be to God.